Hey everyone. So the purpose of this video is to give a little background history on the guerrilla wars in Colombia and specifically how we arrive at the situation presently, where it looks very favorable for the former guerrilla Gustavo Petro to win the upcoming election, which I believe is in May of this year. For this, I want to go kind of far back and give a brief overview. And this is definitely a kind of, this is not a field of expertise of mine, but because Colombian history is very complicated and a real challenge to penetrate, I'm going to kind of just go over some of the main events in order to provide a broad sketch. So kind of extracting from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, the way that the magical realism in his hands is this kind of device for explaining certain moments in the history, like the banana workers' strike, where one of the Buendia clan witnesses this massacre of workers and arrives back in the town to confirm, just is amazed that he's alive, and he's met with this incredulity. Every door he goes to, people are like, "What strike? What massacre?" Nothing like that ever occurred. And so, the sort of the tweaking, the magical element is the way that something like that people can be disappeared, history can be vanished, of course, personally, I think there's other interesting deployments of the technique. The yellow butterflies appearing when these two lovers meet. I like that stuff. But the way that the history is sort of woven into the story is also really useful. And what that does with Colombian history is it talks about the kind of long history of civil wars and the what's known as the la hegemonía conservadora, so that there's a kind of conservative, the resistance to even constitutional democracy, and this is a period in this region in which you have these contests between liberal, more democratic forces. In neighboring Ecuador, interestingly, much earlier, there's a liberal revolution at the end of the 19th century that breaks this hegemony. This happens in Colombia in 1930, and you have about 15 years of liberal governments. But what happens during that time is that there are the birth of the Communist Party, there are massive strikes, there's continued repression of workers, and so there's a split within the Liberal Party, and the main figure to emerge from that split will then be assassinated on the verge of a kind of unprecedented election in 1948. And this is really the key date for understanding a lot of these processes. It's kind of a before and after. The assassination of Gaitan, two things happen in Bogota at this moment. One is that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is in Bogota renting a flat right next to the square. So he sees in real time the riots that break out, and this turns into what's known as the Bogotazo. Bogota is occupied. Left liberal guerrillas take over and kind of administer the city in one of these interesting moments of kind of alternative forms of direct democracy. And also Fidel Castro is in Bogota at this moment, who will later become friends with Garcia Marquez, but of course has his own history. He's there being sponsored by the Argentine Perón president for a kind of youth conference. So he's meeting with Gaitan, And this is at the moment of the beginning of the OAS, the Organization of American States, which is the U.S. We can see in this context there's evidence that the CIA is involved in the assassination, but the overwhelming evidence, of course, is not just the assassination, but the long, the decades-long patterns of influence and the kind of natural laws that are imposed, setting a limit on what forms of democracy are acceptable and what forms of dictatorship and paramilitary activity are acceptable and what forms of democracy are not. So on the eve of the creation of the OAS, Gaitan appears to be too populist, too sympathetic to communism. He's not a communist. He had met with Fidel Castro. They were going to have another meeting. Castro is a very young activist at this point, and not yet a revolutionary. But these are these fascinating moments in which we see moving towards the Cuban Revolution. Really, I would argue that this assassination in '48 and then the Guatemalan coup in '54 that Che Guevara sees, these are two, very impressionable experiences that in some ways advise Che and Fidel on, what they're up against and how they're able to then avoid certain pitfalls as they achieve the Cuban Revolution successfully. So with Gaitan assassinated, immediately revolution breaks out, and you enter into a period in Colombia known as La Violencia. And while there had already been guerrilla experiences and civil wars in Colombia, this really inaugurates a kind of permanent state of war. And some of the vacillations within this, the violencia is usually described as lasting for about 10 years. That doesn't mean that the violence ends. There's sort of a change in the governing tactics. So after '48, a dictator steps in named Rojas Pinilla, and he will attempt to kind of pacify things with amnesty for some of the liberal guerrillas. And he is then overthrown in about '58 because there's the creation of a pact between the liberal and the conservative forces called Frente Nacional. And this is basically an explicit attempt to freeze out any other alternatives. It will be a power sharing, really without any democratic input, just a kind of simple alternation between these two ruling cliques. And so this creation of the Frente Nacional, the removal of Rojas Pinilla, he's put into exile, and there's an important assassination of one of the guerrillas who agrees to the amnesty. What's his name? Charco Negro, I think. Charro Negro, disculpa. Jacobo Prias Alape. He is assassinated in January of 1960. And so these events lead to the creation of the FARC and the ELN, the two largest and most famous and long-standing guerrilla groups in Colombia. So this is kind of important to understand what happens, the launch of these groups. For one thing, the Communist Party officially embraces the armed struggle. So the FARC is really an arm of the Communist Party. And large sections of Colombia are then taken over by worker-associated campesino movement, and this growing kind of guerrillization of society. So while they don't take over the seat of power, they're actually in control of large sections of the country from the '60s on. This is also the point at which the Cold War really kind of takes seat in Colombia, and the United States kind of doubles down on, the gloves come off, all sorts of massacres and tactics are embraced in this, kind of what we see in every situation at this time. refusal to allow any socialist alternative to come to pass. So even though large portions of the country are in the control of guerrillas, the U.S. will spend money and whatever other tactics are necessary to prevent them from coming to power. Rojas Pinilla then will have, his story is not over. He will sort of return in the 60s as the only person standing outside of the Frente Nacional who's attempting to break this, and so he starts to kind of color himself as more of a populist. And of course, he's been exiled by the Frente Nacional and jailed and attempted to be frozen out of the ability to run again. So he will lose his first attempt, and then in 1970 he's running again, and this time he actually allies with some of the communist groups, and really it's like one of these coalitions that's like all hands on board in order to break with basically this two-party dictatorship with the Frente Nacional, which is understood as really just a single pact. And so that election in 1970 is where you see the creation of the guerrilla group, the M19, April 19th movement, and they are more urban student movement. This Gustavo Petro is not originally part of the foundation of it, but he will come in the mid 70s, and they're really born at the state of this 1970 election, which is seen by many people as fraudulent. The numbers are cooked, and even though Rojas Pinilla was has his own past as a dictator. It's understood that at this moment he's kind of standing for some democratization or some break with a dictatorship at the moment. So that's the creation of the M19, another guerrilla group. They're not Marxist. They're allied with different guerrilla groups at different times, and in a kind of fascinating moment of internationalism, after they sort of come into being in 1986, along with groups from all over South America, they attempt to take over the city of Cali after one of their leaders is assassinated, and they call this coalition Batallón America, and they allied in this attempt at a siege with an indigenous guerrilla group called Movimiento Armado Quintín Lame, an Ecuadorian guerrilla group called Afaro Vive, Afaro Vive Carajo, and Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru from Peru. I've read that also the Uruguayan Tupamarus were involved in this, so that would be a fascinating story to know more about how these groups were so interconnected. At this time, also, there are splits going on within the FARC, and you see the kind of rise of the, of course, Pablo Escobar and the Cartel Cali, these large narco-trafficking organizations, and also because the FARC and the ELN control these large rural areas of Colombia, they're involved in the cocoa production. And jumping ahead a little bit, but a really interesting detail about this that I've just observed is that in the recent peace talks that were administered by Rafael Correa in 2017, where the FARC put down their arms and agreed to, after decades of this struggle, they agreed to a peace accords. The ELN did not. And one of the things that came out of those accords, now these were then shut down by the right-wing president Ivan Duque in Colombia, and also there's Correa here in Ecuador is gone. So some of that moment has seemed to be eclipsed, and as has happened in a lot of this history, when these guerrillas agree to amnesty, they're then assassinated. So the situation now is that the FARC laid down their arms, the ELN did not. One of the representatives of the ELN in those talks, I think this was going on in Cuba, or maybe it was in Ecuador, but he said that their relationship to the narco trafficking is that they control the coca producing areas, but they don't have any technology or distribution expertise the way that these giant Mexican cartels do. And so really their control goes from the campesina coca leaf production to just where it's called pasta, like making it into paste. But all the chemicals that are added, that immediately is all now taken. That's the level at which this is all administered by the Mexican cartels, and the two cartels that have now formed into these international conglomerates, the Sinaloa cartel and the Nuevo Jalisco Generación cartel, and we see these struggles. The struggle between these two international organizations playing out all over, the huge massacres that happened in the prison here, Guayaquil, last year in 2021, really just unprecedented violence of people being burned, atrocities on Instagram and all this stuff. That was basically turf war over the major routes of the coca production and being funneled south to the sea, the port of Guayaquil through Ecuador. And so slightly kind of off base, but because the FARC and the ELN for so long have been implicated in and smeared of, this is one of the criticisms, of course, on the left, is that they sort of lost any principles, democratic or socialist or otherwise, and just became another terrorist or narco-trafficking group. And so that's an interesting defense that one could develop. That the idea that the relationship to the coca production, and I think there's some larger questions I'm not going to be able to get into at the moment about the legalization of drugs, and why is it that just the relationship between paramilitary activity, anti-communism, state manipulation of these paramilitary organizations, and drug trafficking. That kind of nexus. There's a certain puzzle there to crack. But to kind of finish off this narrative about the guerrilla groups, the M19 is not linked to those tendencies, and in that way is able to sort of preserve a certain legitimacy within the democratic electoral sphere. They much earlier in the late 80s come into an accord with the government, a certain amnesty. Gustavo Petro is imprisoned at the time at which one of the there's several actions that M19 becomes notorious for, and there's a really crazy event that takes place, which is the storming of the Palace of Justice, in which we now know that the hostages that were taken were actually killed by the Colombian government even after they were let out. So people who escaped alive were then tracked down by the government and assassinated. And this, as science fiction or magical realism as it might seem, this is really part of the long history of the dirty war that the government repeatedly gets into bed with paramilitary groups, its own drug trafficking, the assassination of peasants, the false positive scandal, where they're basically just collecting bodies and then later claiming that these innocent people were armed or had some relationship to guerrillas when they did not. And so because Petro was imprisoned at that time, he was able to later come out and launch a political career as a representative, and so with accumulating legitimacy, he was second in the last election, 2017, where there was some indications of fraud and has been far ahead in the polls for the 2022 election, and doing a lot of media. The Samana Journal has pretty good coverage of contemporary Colombian politics, and so that's a kind of overview of the stuff that I wanted to get into. I'll try to pick up on some of these threads about the kind of splintering some of the other guerrilla groups that were active in that area in another video. Thanks a lot.